Chapter 42 through 43 of the Fallout fanfiction work, Paul's Letter to Rome, narrated by Hannah Young, daughter of Lieutenant Paul Young of the new Canaan Guard, 2278. Chapter 42, A Story Long Overdue. I grew up inside those walls, not many years after what we've called the migration from Ogden. Our community's always had it rough, even since the start. You might see some new Canaanites in the market, see the pretty dresses on the women, see the smiles on the men's faces, but don't believe anyone who might say we were spared from so much of the wastes. We fought for what we have, and we die for what we have over and over again, and others might take that as a reason to seal themselves off from the rest of the world, like one of those vault communities before the bombs. No. It was pretty much day one that our community was nearly crushed from existence. I've read about it in school. I've read about the horror of those first days and far too much about what happened before our community even came to be. I've read about the people who blamed our God for what happened to the world. They tracked down and killed men and women like us in the early years. They've blamed our book for causing the bombs of 2077. And yes, our people were almost rendered completely extinct before the fallout even landed. It's easy to think that what we do is crazy, think we are ignorant or stupid, especially when you know where we could be. And I see why you would when you see how different those people within the walls are, but I spoke about fighting since day one for a reason. I am the descendant of one of those who helped establish the community you see today, when the world was ripping itself apart on the surface we now live upon, while many of my brothers and sisters were being killed for what they believed or knew to be true. There were those of my family who survived by the shelters. There were those of my faith who survived the bombs, lived in the shelters, and could have probably lived in those same shelters for the next 200 years if they didn't know how important their faith was. I've seen the records, visited the sites, and seen those arcs sealed after the emergence, and although some might want to call us stupid for leaving the safety of the shelters and sealing them behind us, all I have to do is ask you to look around. Where's the NCR? They're busy fighting an army of slavers for an old world wall. Too busy trying to rake their claws in an old world city devoted to greed. A nation like that is doomed to die when it's trying so hard to emulate a nation that got itself saturated in nuclear bombs and radiation, and will end up taking a lot of people down in the crossfire wherever they decide to move to. I'm sure I don't even need to ask, but what good is the Legion going to do for literally anyone? You can easily argue that the need to serve something much larger than the individual is the default state of every human heart. But what kind of options are slave or fanatical warrior slave? Then you can look around the wilderness, the place where we live. You can point to the state of the wilderness and think the chaos of warring tribes and raiders is proof that my home doesn't have much better ideas when you compare it to the lands of Caesar or the lands of California. We aren't trying to emulate something that has already failed, a nation that got itself destroyed. So I'll ask anyone to look again, look deeper at what we're trying to accomplish. We aren't trying to build a nation, ensure the safest territory, or build the biggest army. If you look at New Canaan, you will see a symbol, a way to live, a way that has proved to work for thousands of years. You see the war across the wilderness, and you see so much death and hate and fighting. And then you look to the lands of nations like the East or West, and you see the same thing, just on a bigger scale. Anyone who sets foot in this wilderness looks at the light of the temple and doesn't even need to enter through those gates to know that what we're doing is different. What we do is not hard. It's actually very easy. But people come to our gates, hear the lesson, and forget the lesson the second they step foot past the last stalls along the market road. You want to know why we haven't tamed the wilderness after over 200 years since the bombs? It's because unlike those of the nations outside the wilderness, we don't force anyone to do what we do. It's because we know that although our way is the correct way, it is not a way that can ever work if people are dragged into it against their will, sent to it through practicality, or enslaved into it. And still, our beacon stands as something so different from everything else out there. You look around the wilderness we inhabit, see all that awfulness, and then look me in the eye and tell me that we should have stayed in our shelters. You look me in the eye and say that it's better we stayed safe, and let everyone in this land above kill and steal and rape one another. Is all that going to happen anyway? Sure, but you tell me that this land does not need at least some place, some minuscule tiny place of relief, a place that looks at all that terror that everyone wants to do, and instead says, no. You come to us if you need something different from what this world says is just human nature. You don't believe that's real? Just look at us. No. Of course we are not perfect. Sometimes we are not even good at being good, but we're going to try. We, my home, will try with everything within us to be something different from all that evil out there, because we know all about the one who did. We know all about the one who actually did this terrible thing called life in this world, and how he did it so well. We are always going to fail at being him, and we are always going to be killed for it. But the greatest thing he ever taught us, taught me and taught this world before we decided to kill this creation, is that just because we will most certainly die for trying to be an example of good, death means nothing when he himself defeated death. I know life after death is real because I myself have been killed so many times in so many ways. And yes, I have been killed physically as well. When I was 18, I set out for missionary work just like all new Canaanites do. I can admit that I wasn't all that excited to go on mission. I looked up to my father, the man who raised me, and admired what he did for the Guard. I just never really saw missionary work or even life in the Guard as my purpose. The constable doesn't talk about it much, but he was fairly close with my mother and father. My parents were a very young couple when they had me, and they were taken from me when I was very young. You can say that I was introduced to just how terrible the wilderness was when my father was killed out there, and my mother died of disease scarcely a few months or a year later. I can't really tell you much about the parents. I never really knew them. All I can tell you was that I woke up one morning to Mr. Graff standing in the doorway, preventing me from seeing the body of my mom when she was carted out of our home after struggling with sickness for a while. I remember him leading me to the door of my new father, the man of the Guard, and his beautiful wife. They embraced me with tears of sorrow in their eyes, unsure how to help me, or even what to tell me about what happened to my mother. They raised me well. I grew up knowing every person in town. My adoptive father, Obadiah Hanshaw, was exceptionally admired and loved by everyone in the community, and I did my best to be just like him as I grew up. But I don't need to tell someone like you that scars, even scars from so long ago, sometimes don't fully heal. I could not see myself as a man of the Guard. I did not want anyone to think I got my position due to my father, and simply could not see myself going into any of the other trades. I was great in school, learned to read and write and do math so well, and for a time I was so great at Bible studies and evangelizing to those who came to our gates that I considered going into the temple sect. But I also grew up with her. I grew up right alongside the beautiful green-eyed girl with the light brown and nearly red hair and the light freckles that I'd later marry. We fell in love in our later years, and as we approached the age of our first mission, we made plans to get married as soon as we returned home. Still with no real direction, still unsure of what exactly my place was in the community, a small part of me did look forward to mission, since that has always been said to be something that helped young men like me sort that out. Although the overwhelming majority of me just wanted to get the thing over with in order to marry the girl I grew up alongside. It may not be too necessary to say, but a young man who lost his parents before he developed true consciousness grew up with a fairly decent idea about how fragile life can be, or how dangerous the world outside is. We are not naive, we understand what lurks outside, and perhaps we are sheltered from the worst details. We know what we are going into. We've been to the funerals, we've heard the stories, we've gotten our samples, and we've seen our history. Although knowing a lot about something isn't the same as knowing that something. I entered that wasteland for the first real time with one of my brothers and two of my sisters as we followed the men of the Guard to the post outside town where we were to meet our missionary. The man would lead us to our stay with the Tokawana people out east. None of us had ever met Mr. Austin Wesley, but when he stepped towards us, gave that smile and gestured with his arm to follow him, some of the things my instructor in missions prep told me began to make sense, I couldn't quite tell you why. Many times during my years in missions prep, I'd be seated in front of Mr. Walton when he'd say things like, "I think you'll begin to feel better and have a clearer idea where to go in life when you meet Mr. Wesley." I remembered the constable being exceptionally pleased when I learned that me and 3 others would be accompanying Austin Wesley on mission. Although Obadiah was never a harsh father, it seemed as though the mere mention of that unknown missionary caused him to lighten up on me for months. The others of my mission group could corroborate this mysterious feeling around the missionary as well. I'd even asked the woman who'd become my wife about it. I asked if her family had ever heard of Austin Wesley of Missions Outreach, and the same thing occurred. All the adults we younger people knew became delighted at the mere mention of the name, and none of us young adults ready to set out had ever so much as heard of him. For whatever reason, I'd almost completely forgotten all of my troubles back in town upon sight of that man, and remembered the strange little mystery surrounding him. Mr. Wesley smiled at our approach, gave each of us a nod, and without any word he gestured for us to follow as we entered the wilderness for that first real time. We kids became curious, excited, and eager almost, as we followed him off the roads, and he remained silent all the while. He was nearly totally silent the whole time as the minutes turned slowly into hours. He only stopped to give calls to the scouts attached to us, suggesting a water break or a chance to eat. Hours later, curiosity got the better of the 2 girls in our group, and they'd run to his sides to chat with him along our hike. Each time, he'd cut them short with a gentle smile and soft words like something to the effect of, "We'll chat when we make camp. Is that all right?" The girls would fall back, our home went further into the distance behind us, and one of them would later try again, only to be met with, "It's a little dangerous around these parts. Let's hold off the questions for now." Each time the girls approached, whether with Bible questions about the mission, or about how far we were going, he'd always refuse their questions with the truest and sincerest smile. Night would fall, and the fire was made in safer territory. Now it was my turn to get eager. I was excited to hear what the man would say now that he had a moment to answer questions. He told us he'd speak to us when we made camp, and the anticipation began to eat not only the excited girls but me and the other young man of our group. He looked at us across the fire, just about to speak when one of the scouts approached, whispered something in his ear, and made a motion for us to stay quiet as he snuffed the flame. There in the cold and dark, he walked to each of us, the first words he ever said to me directly being, "Go lay down, do it quiet though. There's some danger out there, a little close for comfort, but nothing to worry about if we stay quiet." Even in the pitch dark, I could see the light of that man's smile. The next 2 days went almost exactly the same as the first day. The next 2 nights were exactly the same. During the walking, however, the girls would approach him, still occasionally asking him questions about scripture. The girls would fall back to me and my friend. A few of the times he'd tell them we were in a dangerous area. Other times the girls would ask questions about theology, his take on this verse versus that verse, or which books of the Bible the tribes were familiar with. All the man would say was something along the lines of, "I don't know. We can find that out though." The 4 of us would think back to time in mission prep about everything we'd heard, and everything recently returned first-time missionaries would tell us. We had heard so many times how the hike out to the assigned tribe was very important. Those who just got back would tell us everything they learned along the way would range from language to customs to observe, to relevant verses to help evangelize, etc., etc. We got none of that. Mr. Wesley was silent, or at least very short with his answers, and yet he still emanated a presence of care and understanding to us while our scout escorts were busy keeping us safe. The minutes and then hours would slowly pass. Our home went further and further with each step, and we began to feel as though we were missing out on very important things to help us in our mission to the tribe that was only said to have been reached out to one other time by our missionaries. Eventually, the girls would approach Mr. Wesley's side and begin to quiz him about his opinion on this chapter in this book of the Bible, or he agrees with what Mr. Walton or Mrs. Lewis said about verse X in book Y. The man again would remain quiet, once more telling them he could chat with them about it later, or saying something like, "I'm not sure. I'd definitely like to find out that answer with you later." Over and over again, the girls would fall back to talk with my friend and me, relaying the questions they asked him, telling his response, and leading to discussions about how Mr./Mrs. so-and-so would go on for a 40-minute lecture about that verse alone. After another 2 nights of no fires, no questions answered, and no tips about what we were going straight into, we began to probably unfairly wonder, what exactly does this man know about the Bible? What has he actually done as a missionary? It was that 4th morning when we set foot on a dirt road in the rocky, hilly, and brush-filled territory that was somewhat frequently used by the allied tribes of the region for trade and migrations. Around midday, we stepped up to a wooden scrap structure surrounded by signs in different languages. Many tents of hide and old-world cloth were set up around the place, and a large group of people in garb of every description and material were wandering about, while another large group were waiting to enter the little structure. It was here that the scouts and then Mr. Wesley told us we were at a trading post used by many of the local tribes, and that this was our best chance to stock up before the last trek to the Tokuwana's home on the Little East Fork. Just as we began to ask the missionary if he would finally answer our questions and tell us what we needed to know to be good missionaries, all our questions were cut short as we stepped toward the structure. The tribespeople of so many friendly people in the region all began to turn their heads towards the man, beginning to whisper to one another until we approached the line of people waiting to get into the trading post itself. People began running up to Mr. Wesley, men, women, and children, many with tears in their eyes as they spoke at him in various languages. He was swarmed. Many warriors and tribal males would shake his hand. The women would embrace him, and the children would cling to him. Me and the others could only step out of the way and stand by while Mr. Wesley was soon surrounded by several dozen people, all evidently overjoyed to see him again. And yet, through it all, I could hear the man speaking at them all with a smile, talking in various languages, and occasionally pointing at the sky as if to give a reminder to all these people that he was not the one to be thanked for anything. Even the scouts attached to our group were wowed. None of us had ever seen anything like what happened to Mr. Wesley at that trade post in the wilderness. Eventually, he began making gestures for us young adults and scouts to come over, and soon enough, we were swarmed as well. Each person of the wilderness, all speaking words we could not understand at us, as we were embraced by people with tears in their eyes. None of us knew what to make of the whole thing, but it seemed to answer several questions we had in a way we couldn't explain, while it also gave rise to even more questions. Eventually, the event died down, several began to depart, and although we could not understand a word Mr. Wesley was saying to any of the people around him, we watched him take a young tribal mother who'd been sobbing since the start around back to a clear little pond behind the shack, followed by a group of small children. Me and the 3 other first-time missionaries in our group watched the man as he held a Bible in one hand, speaking tribal words that were completely foreign to us before lowering the mother into the water. When her head went under, he pulled her up, and the mother did not cease her tears as she embraced him. We watched as the man did the same for each of the woman's 5 small children, each one coming out of the water and running to their mother's side through the cheers of those who followed the beloved missionary to the pond. All we could do was watch and join the applause when necessary, the mysterious, silent missionary standing soaked in the water with that subtle smile on his face. We must have spent a few hours at the post, and the man scarcely said a word to us first-timers as his attention was kept by the tribals still beyond happy to see him again. Eventually, however, the crowds did depart, and eventually, Mr. Wesley was speaking with our 2 scouts as the sun set, and a group of tribals with spears and one with a painted and decorated carbine stood by. The scouts approached us first-timers and gave their goodbyes to the 4 of us, saying that Mr. Wesley was offered protection for the rest of the trip by some warriors of the Tokuwanas. The young men of the scouts gave their offering of armaments to us before leaving our company, as was customary during the time. The other young man and one of the young women each took the offering and placed the semi-auto .45 pistols in their satchels. Myself and the other girl were armed by our parents before departure, me because I was the son of a lieutenant of the Guard who would become constable in only a few short years. In the end, the scouts of the Guard gave each of us a parting embrace and told us to have fun before setting off back toward home. Then, scarcely 2 minutes later, Mr. Wesley gave us a smile, then motioned for us to follow him as we followed the Tokawana warriors further into the east. 2 more days passed in relative silence, the event having created a new enthusiasm in the girls, only for that enthusiasm to quickly be dashed to pieces by the short answers of the missionary. Needless to say, the closer we drew towards the Tokawana's home, and after even more non-answers, it was night, and we were told as we made camp how we'd be arriving at the Tokawana's home sometime in the late morning. This last night was different. The missionary had finally, at long last, kept his word. The fire was keeping the cold at bay, and although the girls and the other young man were relatively thankful to finally get their questions answered, it was a little too late for me. I didn't even think the silence of the missionary affected me the way it did that last night. I already didn't feel like I even wanted to go on mission before setting out. And although the man's appearance that first morning seemed to spark something in me, that something was quickly and unconsciously diminished by the man's silence. What happened at the trading post again seemed to bring that something to life, only for it to again be diminished during the silence before this last night. As the girls began asking the same questions they'd ask all throughout the long days of hiking, and the missionary began answering with that slight smile, I couldn't bring myself to stay, and almost immediately departed the glow of the flame. I found myself sitting on a little rocky cliff, looking out over the long drop and mile-long stretch to the river that sparkled in the moonlight. Although I was not more than a decent stone's throw from the campfire, I found the solitude more fitting, and was far enough to not distinguish the words being said as it came to me in one soft sound in the cold breeze. I couldn't quite tell you why I felt the way I did, but I felt somewhat angry at the idea of the man just now being available to answer all the questions that were supposed to help us for what was only a few short hours away. Atop that ridge, I tried to think of what I would need to do for the tribes to help them learn about the Lord we served, knowing I could get the answers if I returned to the flame. But my body and mind prevented me from doing that. Mostly, I was stuck in thoughts of home, thoughts of Danny, the woman I'd marry, and how I still had no idea what I wanted to do for the community when I finally returned home. For a minute back at the trading post, I considered making good on my thoughts of joining the temple sect, or the missionaries. Then, I thought of Mr. Wesley's silence yet again, before finally deciding to engage with us, only hours before our task from God would begin. The minutes passed, then more minutes, and then more. The conversation back at the campfire increasing in volume, even punctuated by the occasional laugh until finally it stopped. Another minute passed, and my eyes stayed on the faraway river, even as I heard the footsteps behind me. A moment later, I saw the man in his flannel shirt and vest and wide-brimmed hat take a seat on the ridge right beside me. I greeted him with a simple, "Hey, Mr. Wesley," my focus still out in that wild. Almost just as expected, the man did not answer. He just took in the same view as me, reclining back on his hands, that smile still on his face, and looking out at that river beneath the stars. I heard the low talking behind me at the distant campfire between the other young man and the 2 girls, but I was just fine in the silence. After probably a few minutes, he broke the calm. "Quite a view, huh, Paul?" I could only nod. The silence resumed between us before I said my thoughts aloud. "I could hear y'all chatting back there. Share any good tips with the others? Anything I can expect? Anything to help us do things for the kingdom like you did at the trade post?" He had clearly heard the sarcasm in my voice, but when I was done, he began to laugh softly, and this only made me angry. I didn't think this mission, or missions in general, were a joke. I looked forward to this time helping me figure out a lot of things in my life back home, and I did not like the start, or that laughing. Mr. Wesley had caught hold of himself and eased himself down, but by the time he's regained his composure, I was looking straight at him. I felt my own face, and it was not wearing a calm one. even as his laughing face returned to that subtle smirk. Studying him in the moonlight, it had not occurred to me just how young he was. He must have been no more than 30. He returned his attention to the river as he asked me the simple question. "You want to know what I told your friends?" He must have seen my slow nod in his peripherals, because his smile became a bit wider, and he said, "There's nothing I can tell you to prepare you for what's next. You won't be using almost anything they taught you in mission prep." He reclined back, that smile remaining, not in an arrogant way, but strangely enough, in a rather comforting way. Those girls kept asking me questions about what I thought of Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse X, or my take on Hebrews chapter 2 verse haha, and I'm like, I don't know. Let me get out my Bible and get back to you. I found myself asking, did you answer some questions about what the Tokuanas are like? At least knowing how to say hello in their language could help us out. Not after I told them the truth, Paul. He looked to me. Even with those questions, I cannot answer for a reason. If you want to know why those people back at the trading post knew me, why I knew their language, why they loved me, why they came to God, why that mother had me baptize her and her children, it's because I didn't know one single thing about the people of those tribes before I showed up at their homes over the past years. I don't get it. I didn't answer those questions because I want you kids to show up at the Tokuana's home tomorrow with open hearts, not full brains. Listen, Paul. I'll admit that I can't tell you what X verse says and the different theological arguments that have been made about Z passage and how it can help comfort a person in Y scenario. But I certainly know people. Although I am working on it, I admit that I can't tell you this particular fact about what Jesus said in this passage, but I know his heart like the person he was and is. I won't be able to recite this verse or that when asked, but I have seen his heart. I've seen what it does for people out here. I've seen the beautiful things he alone has done out here. Take those people back there at the post. Some of them I'd only met once, probably 5 years ago. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't even actually entirely sure what he was saying. Although, I thought I saw a glimpse of it when he glanced my way again and smiled once more. He wiped his eye. Most of those people had gone through quite a lot since then. But that's their story, and you're going to make your own story when we get there, Paul. He smacked me on the shoulder. I can see he's doing something in you, and it's going to be pretty amazing. The man got up, and without even thinking about it, I got up too. I followed him back to the campfire, still trying to figure out exactly what he was telling me, exactly what questions he answered for me. I think I was beginning to see what a heart looked like. A heart doesn't always make complete sense when it speaks, but what you feel when you hear it is undeniable. When it speaks, it's powerful. Thinking about the way that man stood in the water with those children, with that mother weeping tears of the utmost joy, and thinking about the way he grinned at me when we sat on the ridge, I thought just for a second that if I ever saw the heart of Jesus Christ, it was shown just in a flash through that man. We joined the others, and the 5 of us had a nice talk around that warm fire as the cold night went on. We spoke about life, spoke about things at home, and spoke about the girls or boys in other groups out there. Occasionally, one of the Tokuana warriors would join our group, only knowing just enough English to ask to join us and not much more. Still, they'd join us, sitting in the glow, smiling and joining in the joy of we new Canaanites, speaking words to us we couldn't understand, and us doing likewise. The grins never left the warriors' faces, even as they left the glow to take places in the night. Our group was not greeted when we arrived in the sprawling village of hide tents and makeshift structures beside the river. The girls panicked, forgetting what was said last night, and again asking Mr. Wesley how to introduce themselves in the Tokuana's language. Mr. Wesley only reminded them of the answer he didn't provide to that specific question when he pointed to an elderly woman in a shawl holding an armful of pelts trying to move while trying not to trip over a group of kids that was running circles around her like a swarm of Mongols. The girls approached, one helping the woman by carrying half of the stack in her arms, the other rounding up the children and beginning to whistle a tune that the kids tried to emulate. I watched those girls I knew so well merge into the flowing stream of life within the village without any effort, and without any knowledge of how to say a single word in the Tokawana language. My gaze slowly went to Mr. Wesley, who was looking straight at me with that smirk that now seemed to say, "Told you," before he gestured his head towards something to the right as he said to me, "Care to join me with this one?" I nodded, not knowing exactly what he was saying before I followed him into the waters of life within the village. Mr. Wesley and I approached the group of men and hunters carrying heavy crates of feed and scavenged goods towards the little grazing grounds beside the fishing platforms along the waters. Just as we began to help alleviate the burden of these tribal scavers and ranchers, the other young man called to Mr. Wesley from behind. "Mr. Wesley, what should I do?" The missionary took the heavy box in his hands and called over to the kid, "Didn't you quiz me about Matthew 10:8 last night?" The young man stood in place and the missionary added, "I gave you my extra med kit for a reason, kid." I walked side by side with Mr. Wesley following the tribals, and the last time I saw the other young man of our group that day, he was sitting in front of a tribal man with broken feet in a lean-to, med kit open, and doing precisely what Matthew 10:8 told the men over 2,000 years ago to do. 6 months later, the girl who helped the woman with the hides would go to her home, help her with the skins, watch her grandson, meet the parents, help them trade, watch their kids, help the family make a meal, dine with them, and even meet the chief. The girl who wrangled the kids would lead them out of the road, teach them songs from the temple, keep them out of the way of the busy people at work in the early afternoon, take them to their homes, meet their parents, receive their gratitude, and help the women with their chores. The other young man would help that man's destroyed feet with old-world medicines we brought from our home, be escorted across the village to the other sick, healing radiation, making casts, and was probably the only one of us who put some of what he learned in mission prep about first aid to use. Mr. Wesley and I dropped off the boxes in the cattle pens, filled the troughs, joined some fishermen on the shore, helped them haul in nets, and began helping a big group of men construct wood railing that would later be used in a platform for a water wheel. And this was just the first day. The 5 of us were later brought before the chief, who was momentarily upset about the fact that we didn't introduce ourselves to the tribe. Mr. Wesley joked, with the help of a Tokiwana interpreter, that his group had indeed introduced themselves to the tribe, just not through a meeting with the chief. The chief even laughed at this. Mr. Wesley explained that his group only just merged with the tribe in order to say that we weren't there for special introductions, special treatments, or anything like that. We were just there to help his people in whatever way needed. The chief appreciated this immensely, still somewhat puzzled by the bizarre customs of New Canaanites, since he'd only had one other experience with our people through the initial outreach team. The second night included a nice dinner with the elders and prominent members of the tribe, where we were treated very well. After those ceremonial events to officially welcome us, what happened the first day was what would happen day after day. Each day we'd wake up and do whatever we could for the people of this tribe, whenever we could. The girls and the other young man had already established their own little reputations. One of the girls would become very close with that particular family, and later be there to pray for the grandmother who'd leave this earth scarcely 2 months after first meeting her. The other girl in our group would become very involved with the kids of the village, taking care of them, learning from them, having fun with them, and teaching them while their parents were working during the day. She would also become very close with many of the women in the women's groups, helping them with their chores across the village while the husbands were busy or out in the wilderness. The other young man was already established in town as a healer, and that work made him revered by nearly everyone in a tribe where the old world medicines had been used up decades ago, using only what he or any of us knew from mission prep and classes about first aid to work right alongside some of the elders or healers, learning new remedies from herbs in the wild, and teaching the others new Canaan or old world techniques to heal maladies of every description. Mr. Wesley stuck by me, or I stuck by him. I don't know which, but every day he and I would find ourselves working with a big group of men in the tribe, whether that was on construction jobs, fishing groups, field crews, or hunting parties. Wherever I was, I always had Mr. Wesley on one side and a man of the Tokiwana on another. We all worked side by side with the people of the tribe, worked as part of their lives, we made friends, and the girls became members of new families. We learned their language, and they learned ours, word by word, and there were days when I'd completely forget about my life at home. I forgot about my troubles, while at the same time getting a clearer picture of what my life at home would look like whenever I got back there. I never forgot the face of Danny, even though I will admit that I began to see a number of the girls of the tribe in a way I hadn't at the start. I envisioned my wedding to Danny, and hammered in the last nail on the finally finished water wheel, hearing the cheers of the men of our group, feeling the grin of Wesley beside me. And then I'd turn to the new friend on my right to respond to his question and pat on the back. Mish tak na, tak Yahweh. Don't thank me, thank God. That's the only phrase I remember of that dead language. That day, about 6 months after we arrived, was the proudest day of my life, as it was also the most conflicting day as well. Mr. Wesley had us first-time missionaries gather those we were closest to, those most willing, and ask if they wanted to be baptized. Standing in the shallow waters, I was somewhat envious of the others. Between the 2 girls and the other young man, they had preached enough of the gospel to gather 13 men and 11 women of the tribe to be baptized, while I had only gotten 1 man. I knew that the only reason the girl closest to the tribe's children didn't have more was because the chieftain had forbidden the baptizing of children, as children were not allowed to actively participate in any rituals of outsiders until they underwent their maturity ceremony at 15. This was a custom we would not argue against, especially since the chieftain was so friendly. Looking back, I know I am not alone in wishing we had subverted this request, but in this event, doing so would not help me with my 1 convert standing in the water with me. In the days previous, Mr. Wesley told me it was not a competition, but it was hard for it not to feel that way when the others did so much better. The water wheel slowly turned in the river current behind me, grinding the razor grain of the harvest, and I listened to it moving, the thing grinding my shame ever so slowly to replace it with pride. I envisioned my future at home in construction, wondering if the pride I felt in the creation of that structure was a sign that was where I was to go whenever I got home. So, with my hand on the shoulder of the one and only young man I convinced Jesus was worth following, I looked to the others, feeling not that great about anything, minus my work on the water wheel, until Mr. Wesley stepped before me with that smile. Mr. Wesley gave me that wink, then gestured with his head towards the large group of hunters and male laborers off to the side, and said to me, "You're just the spark, Paul. I told him you and I are still working on that lot over there." I gave the man a nod, knowing without any more doubt that this young tribal man I stood with was only the beginning. My shame disappeared in an instant, and I met eyes with the grinning young man who gave me a thumbs up. It was a simple gesture I'd taught him, but I gave him one back, and as Wesley began to pray, I knew what joy was. I thought of what Wesley said in those waters, then thought of everything else he said to me over the past months, and when it was finally my turn to speak, I asked the young tribal man called Uinta Joan if he accepted Jesus Christ as his Lord and Savior. The young man punched me in the center of the chest, howled to the sky, shouted his answer, "Yes," and I lowered him into the water. Never had I ever felt as much joy before this moment than when I pulled Uinta from the water and heard everyone in the tribe who came to watch the spectacle shouting from the shoreline. Many did not understand the baptism, but watched their friends choose to undergo it anyway under the care of us young people from a distant place. Those Tokuwanas did not know what they were looking at when the girls raised their tribal friends from the water, but they saw the tears, the love, the true care, and overpowering joy. They saw the young man of our group raise the sick and injured from the water, seeing each one come out different. They probably couldn't tell you what was different at the moment after emerging, but each person was undeniably different in a way beyond sight, but different in a way far later that would only be traceable back to that moment they answered yes to that question. I felt those strong, tattooed arms wrap around me, and nearly had all the wind squeezed out of me as I saw Mr. Wesley laughing, my friends of mission clapping, and everyone on the shoreline cheering. There are so many who are just like me within those walls, atop those towers, behind those barricades, who experience so many of the same things, perhaps only on different levels. I know at least a dozen men on the day shift alone who can tell you almost the same story. But it doesn't make it any easier when you relive it in your mind. I think about that last hunting trip I went on with Wesley before the baptism. We were heading back with several large golden geckos strapped to the thick transport beams when a spear landed next to a group of hunters, accompanying us. I think we were all momentarily puzzled before another spear landed, then a tomahawk, and then some gunshots. The warriors spread out in a flash, some already beginning to move up the rocks to engage the attackers, when I found myself firing my gun up at that sandy ridge with the large rocks leading up to the jagged cliff. I couldn't get off more than 2 shots before I was thrown to the floor, not even realizing what was happening. Thinking I'd been tackled by one of our group's attackers, I fought the person only to stop when I saw it was Wesley. The man pinned me to the ground with a strong arm, staring at me with wide eyes and a shaking finger over his lips as he stuttered, "Shh, don't move. Stay down. Stay safe. You'll be fine. Don't panic." The man pulled the pistol from his belt, aiming out at the enemies in the rocks. His arm trembled violently, his nerves seeming to be replaced by panic. More of our warriors scrambled up the sandy rise as a couple other guns of our attackers popped off on the left. Mr. Wesley shifted the gun to the new group of raider gunners on the left, only pointing it up at them before he began to smack the pistol with his other hand. My God, why won't you fire?" He studied the thing, kneeling beside me, and my hand gently rose till I was holding the gun in his hand. Without any resistance, I took the pistol from his hand as he continued to tremble like a leaf. I switched the safety off and pointed up at those rocks on the left. I pulled the trigger, feeling the gun recoil in my grip until I had emptied the magazine. The other warriors of our party saw where my shots hit as I aimed up at those rocks, and the warriors who stayed back with us to offer ranged support began sending arrow after arrow, and bullet after bullet up at them before our men were done with those original ones they made contact with. As the moments passed, the gunshots faded into silence, the raiders all retreating or killed, and I watched Wesley sitting upright, still collecting himself. More time passed, and the warriors began to trickle back down the sandy rise, back to us, and the man continued to breathe deeply. The warriors met with the others back by us, all patting themselves for injuries and looking around to ensure the attack was indeed over, and I had stood myself up, placing a hand on Wesley. When my hand touched his shoulder, his eyes shot open, and he calmed himself again immediately when he saw it was just me, saying with a forced laugh, "Hey, Paul, you all right?" There was nothing to say, I just nodded, silently telling the man everything was fine now. Thanks for that, Paul. I'm so sorry, son." He grabbed my hand and hoisted himself up to his feet, glancing at the congregated group of warriors now seeing to some of the injured, as he forced a soft laugh from himself. You'd think I'd remember to flip the dang safety off before... I'm sorry, son. I thought of that trembling hand, that terrified look in his eye, and how he threw me to the ground, absolutely petrified in fear, but still, what he did was the bravest thing I'd ever seen up to that point. Without anything else, I grabbed the man's shoulder, gave it a firm grip, and handed his gun back when he, still catching his breath, said to me with that same smile he almost always wore, No, you hold on to that, Paul. You're better with that than I am." He forced another chuckle before grabbing my shoulder and said, "Thanks, son." I still think about that all the time, and even now I think about that look he had on his face after he threw me to the ground for safety. I hear those words, and although I may not have known it in that very moment, even that terrified face proved he was the bravest man I'd ever met as I told him, "It's all right, sir. They're going to need your help with the injured." He nodded, and we walked to the warriors and hunters together. There were no deaths, but there were 6 injured in our hunting party. From what I heard, there were only about 4 dead raiders, but there had been much worse attacks. There was not a week that went by that the raiders at Red Castle didn't attack. The Tokuanas had been attacked by them several times in the past months. even since we arrived. My whole group helped treat the injured in attacks by them and even attended the funerals. It wasn't more than a week after the baptism that we were part of a new celebration. This celebration was for the news we received from the Tokuwana's allies in the Muchacanos about the destruction of Red Castle. An enemy, believed to be the Mazers, was said to have completely taken over the Red Castle fortress. Our most bothersome enemy in this part of the wilderness, a clan of vicious raiders who had caused so much heartache for the Tokuwanas, were said to have been completely destroyed. But just because an even bigger fish takes over a lesser fish's home, that doesn't mean the lesser fish was killed. I don't remember the attack. I still try not to think about it. I think my brain wouldn't let me remember that attack. I wish my mind would have blocked out what I so vividly remember, but I know why he wouldn't let that happen. All I see are the fires. I hear the screaming, the gunshots, the crackle of flame, the burst of bombs, the cackling, and not a minute goes by that I don't hear the crying. It may be buried in the sounds of the day-to-day, the jokes from my men, the words of my wife, the laughs of my children. But when everything goes silent, it's still there. I hear those girls crying the most desperate, painful cries. I remember the tears on my own cheeks, the gun recoiling in my grip, and how it did nothing to prevent what was inevitable. I remember Mr. Wesley finding all 4 of us as the fires burned, seeing the bodies collapse to the ground, the kids falling into tears over the bodies of their mothers, and I see his frantic, terrified face as I hear his words, "We're going to be fine." Those words repeat in my mind again and again in my mind, and as unsure and afraid as those words were, I believed them with all my heart. I believed his words as the girls cried, the fires burned, and the cackling went on and on and on and on and on. I can't even remember crying, but I felt the wet streams flowing from my eyes. But I do remember that everywhere we went, everywhere Mr. Wesley tried to lead us, there was fire. The fire was so hot it dried the streams from my eyes the second I'd felt it. Mr. Wesley was so scared, and still the crying went on and on and on as the fire touched my skin, the painful sensation getting hotter and hotter and hotter. I remember the feel of those tight ropes on my wrists and the blood pooling in a boot print in the dirt. And I remember that terrible ringing in my ears, testing the strength of those ropes behind my back, and not being able to move my arms at all before I heard the cries of that girl as I knelt there on the ground. The heat of the inferno around us still burned the skin, and I could feel the presence behind me as I looked up, at long last, to see the bound frame of Mr. Wesley kneeling across from me. I remember feeling more wet streams trickle down my face as I watched the man raise his terrified and tear-streaked face to the girl still sobbing as he mouthed the words, "I'm so sorry. Don't cry. It's all going to be okay, Michelle." My vision blurred, but I saw him turn to the other sobbing girl and mouth the words, "Look at me. Look at me. You're going to be okay, Hannah. Trust me, please, sweetie." I tested my restraints again, but it did nothing, and I felt a cold steel touch my head from the presence behind me as Austin Wesley turned to the young man beside me and mouthed the words, "Stay strong, look at me. You're going to be okay, Joseph." I heard the young man muffle the most terrible cry before Mr. Wesley's eyes finally came to me. I thought of that look of terror in his face I'd seen on that hunting trip, and it was nothing compared to the one I was looking at now. I watched a man I'd come to respect even more than my own adoptive father on this trip stare me straight in the eyes and break more and more apart with each word he said to me. "Look at me. You're going to be fine. You're going to make it out of this. You understand that, Paul?" My eyes blurred to the point I could not see him anymore with the last word he spoke to me. I could not truly see it when the demon behind him struck him across the head and hauled him back onto his knees, or when that huge satanic blur emerged from the flames. The gun behind me was pressed to my head again, this time harder as my vision returned to see a large beast pacing back and forth between us and Mr. Wesley. If ever I had imagined what the incarnation of the devil looked like, it was this creature, a tower of a man in the terrible ragged metal armor ensemble of a Red Castle raider, and the big filterless gas mask with actual horns. The beast stopped his pacing, and I just noticed the creature was holding something in his hands as he knelt in front of Mr. Wesley. The beast raised that something up to Mr. Wesley's eyes. My vision cleared a little more, and it was the severed head of the Tokuwana chief. The sobbing of the girls, and even Joseph picked up as the demon stripped Wesley's pack off his back, carving into his chest with the knife before emptying the thing onto the ground. Kicking the contents across the ground, he picked up the Bible inside, flipped through it, and then chucked it into the chieftain's burning home, crackling behind Mr. Wesley. The girls continued to cry. My eyes blurred again, but that didn't stop me from seeing it in full clarity when I watched the demon slam the head of our friend, the leader of the Tokuwanas, onto the ground. All I could hear was the piercing wails of the girls, and the new sobs of the children somewhere behind me as the demon stomped on the head of our friend again and again and again and again and again. It was stamped into dust and blood, and I'll never forget the sound of that skull breaking apart with each stomp. I'll never forget the cries of Joseph when the demon chucked a handful of the blood and brains at that young man. I'll never forget when the demon gestured for one of the other demons to come forth with a small child. I'll never forget when the tower of a demon grabbed the little boy by the legs. I'll never forget when he began slamming the kid into the ground. I'll never forget the sound of that laughter. I'll never forget the sound of that head hitting the ground, the shattering of the skull, the blood, the screaming of the other kids, the even more hopeless cries of the girls. The sight of that limp body and head breaking apart as it hit the rock again and again and again and again and again. And the fire and the blood and the laughter and the screaming. I'll never forget when 4 other children knelt before the girls. I'll never forget the whimpers of Michelle or Hannah when they were sprayed in the blood of each bullet that killed the kids they loved. I'll never forget the heat of the fire, the bodies of those kids, the obliterated head of the chief, and I'll never forget the words screamed straight into Wesley's face through the mask. "Where the fuck is your God now?" And I'll never forget the look in Wesley's eyes. The look he gave to all 4 of us when the demon screamed through the mask. "Renounce his name. Renounce it right now, and I'll spare your fucking kids." My hero immediately began to sob, unable to say absolutely anything. After only a few seconds, the flame burned brighter, and the demon screamed the words, "That's not an answer." Michelle fell to the dirt. Mr. Wesley broke apart, scarcely able to form a single word as he regained only enough control to sob the words, "I'm so sorry, Michelle." Hannah's head hit the dirt facing me and Joseph, and although I could scarcely see a single detail through the tears in my eyes, I could see how pretty she was. I could see those lifeless eyes, the blood pooling around her head, and the calmest, most peaceful, tear-streaked, ash-covered face. Neither she nor Michelle ever had to worry about something as horrible as this life again. I knew that without any doubt as I cried. I knew that without any doubt when I saw those girls' calm faces, now only touched with the misery of all this life. The tears dried in an instant in the heat of the flames, their faces even more angelic now, as Joseph pleaded through tears and hysteria. "Wesley, just say it, please." But he couldn't get another word out before his head hit the ground. I stared at the remains of the chieftain's shattered skull as the demon struck the head of my friend with a hammer again and again, over and over again. I could see nothing. The world around me disappeared as I stared at that mess of bones and brains, only hearing the hammer and feeling the heat of the flame. I don't know what I was thinking or how much time had passed before I finally looked up and met the eyes of Wesley. The laughter, the crackle of flame, the gunshots, the sobs, the screams, the wind all faded away as I looked at the face of Wesley. Never has there ever been a more broken and defeated face. I'd never seen more tears mark a good man's face, but somewhere deep in those green eyes, I saw something. Just past the tears, the reflection of those flames, past the sorrow, the fear, and the pain. I saw what he'd accepted beneath all that horror and grief just outside his physical body amidst this awful world. What I saw in those eyes, past that tremendous sorrow, told me right then and there that we had already been killed 5 minutes ago. What I saw in those eyes, the eyes of the man I knew, trusted and respected wholeheartedly, was that there was no good that could possibly come if he even could act upon Joseph's plea or the demon's offer. What I saw told me what was true. What I saw told me that there was no reason to believe in a promise of freedom delivered by a demon who just killed everyone we spent over 6 months loving. A promise of freedom and safety delivered by a beast that killed 5 terrified children for no reason beyond savage psychosis and lust of horrific violence. Deep past the tears, the dirt, blood, fear, and supreme sorrow at what he just watched happen to all his work was a trust. He saw a trust in something far greater than himself or me, a trust that knew beyond all reason that what would come from this awful world was beyond anyone's understanding, but a trust that knew that whatever was past this terror and death and fire and screaming and evil was something that was so amazing. Whatever was past this inferno, this heat, the tears of those girls, was absolutely incredible, and it proved to be so when he stared into my eyes, shook his head, and told me as the tears streamed down his face, "I'm so sorry, Paul. He's just too good." I watched Wesley's head hit the dirt a single second before I felt my own head slam into it as well. I never heard or felt the bullet, the hammer, the tomahawk, or the whatever. I didn't feel anything before I found myself sobbing into the earth as the image of Wesley and the others dying replayed in my mind over and over again. All I could see was that, as I cried harder than I ever had in my entire life for seconds, and then minutes, and then more minutes, on and on and on. Slowly, over the seconds, then minutes, then hours, then day, then weeks, the gunshot faded ever so slowly into the distance, revealing the crackle of the flame and the sobbing of the girls. I cried more and more and more, and the crackling flame went on and on, mixed with the unbearable tears of those angels. More minutes, seconds, hours, and the looping image of Wesley's head hitting the dirt slowly merged with the sands I was staring into, and I continued to cry. More time passed, more hours, more days, and little by little, the crackle of flame and the sobbing of the girls faded away. The new sound replaced so slowly by a deafening screech. Eventually, I could not hear anything but the screeching sound, and after even more time, I began to wish for the sound of those sobs, and I couldn't even hear my own crying. I struggled to remember what Wesley said to me, and at last found the screeching so unbearable now that I raised my head from the sand, feeling the grains of sand fall from my face and hair. The sands I laid upon for so long faded from existence, and I simply have no way or words to describe what I was looking at. I was no longer lying in the dirt. I was not looking at the skull of the chief, the murdered children, the lifeless bodies of my friends, the demons, the flames, the burning village, the night, or anything I could describe then or now. I was not kneeling before a golden throne in a golden city, not a bearded man on a cloud, and not a wonderful green paradise where my mom and dad were waiting to greet me. There again are simply no words that exist to even remotely describe what I was staring at or who I was staring at. What I saw was something I knew beyond all logic before I was even born, something I saw and knew when my brain was still being formed in my mother's womb, before, and only a little bit after the first neurons sparked to life in my brain. What I saw was something that we forget almost at the exact second we emerge into the light of this world and enter the darkness of a tragic being, something that is buried under so many lights and sounds and feelings throughout the days, something that is so unbearably hard to see at so many times throughout our lives, something that occupies a place in us that we try to fill with pleasure, with sex, with chemicals, and countless other sensations, but something we cannot comprehend when we see it move in the world. We chalk it up to what we think we know, what we learned, when it's actually something so much greater. What I saw was something I knew beyond all ability to explain. What I saw was something that we won't ever know for sure until we meet it once again, when we are reunited with it at the end of existence, the end of the world. What I saw was a being, an entity, a self-creating creation, an image of every atom, every grain of sand, every blade of grass, Every place, every creature, everything past, everything present, everything that has ever inhabited this earth or will inhabit it. It was an image of pure light in every spectrum, a series of signs and pictures of everything that ever was and everything that will be. It was a story. It was a story that had been told every second of every day since the very beginning, a story that is still being told, a story that still had so much more to say before the writer, the teller of it, is done. And right there, right in the middle of the entirety of this all-encompassing being, there, staring right back at me, encircled by a forever-turning ring of sounds, the images and lights took on the shape of the most beautiful face that could ever possibly exist as the rings and lights continued to turn. It was the face of a man. It was the face of the most beautiful person anyone or anything could have ever known. It was a face that was the amalgamation of every person who had ever lived, lives now, and will ever live. A face that upon sight made me fall right to my knees in the nothing I stood upon. My eyes clouded with more tears. The face disappeared into the lights, and the screaming sound grew even louder and louder, telling me through it all that it was a trillion different sounds and voices as the face faded even more until all that remained was a light going down the center and across the eyes of where that face once was. The sound became louder, and the images disappeared. The light of the being grew brighter and brighter and burned hotter and hotter until all there ever was in this dark, dark, tragic world within the enormous and spectacular creation was that cross emitting its light. It was a man. It was a being, an entity of love so strong and so powerful that it holds the neutrons together, that it keeps the electrons and protons in orbit, that it keeps the rocks together, that it holds this world together, and keeps the flow of time moving on and on forever. It was a being of love so powerful that it entered the most tragic part of its own creation, experienced all that awfulness inside the monumental good, and then chose to die just for me and so many others. He came to this place just for me. He died just for me. And he proved how monumentally good even his own death was when he rose again. Just like he did for me alone. Just like he did when I saw the rings still turning. Just like he did when I heard him tell me through the overwhelming enormity of his true form, "Stand up, son." I was returned to this life sobbing uncontrollably into the sands as the smell of smoke filled my nose, and I could just make out the bodies of the dead beside me. I felt the continually thumping pain in the back of my head, and I was so weak I could not move as I struggled to remember what I saw seconds ago, only for it to disappear by the sight of the lifeless man of the Tokawana beside me and that smell of smoke. It was so bright out, and I started to remember the sight of what happened to my friends. I can't tell you how long I cried into those sands before I heard the rushing footsteps come to a stop around me. Feeling myself come under the grip of several sets of firm but delicate grips, I felt myself get sat up, felt the blood trickle down the back of my head, and after feeling the gentle work of some people behind me, the blurred figure kneeling before wiped my face with a cloth, showing my friend, Uinta. The man knelt there looking at me with the most angry but tragic and happiest and most sorrowful gaze before he threw his arms around me and said through enormous restrained emotion, "Oh my God, Paul, we thought you were dead." Too weak to return the embrace, I could see the row of dead I was laying beside, the graves being dug amidst the smoking, ruined village, and could feel the ongoing pain in the back of my head as those other survivors behind me continued to work. To this day, I do not know if I was shot, beaten, or whatever. Part of me likes to think I was unconscious. Most others will say that I was. But the Tokawanas were not stupid. Those few who survived or managed to get away still put me in a row of the dead after returning to the site of their destroyed home. I still had a blood-pouring mess in the back of my head, and I would learn that I wasn't more than probably only a half hour from getting buried. After getting escorted back home, I underwent 2 months of treatment by the apprentice doctor who would one day take charge of the place, Dr. Stepp. When Danny, my wife-to-be, returned from her own mission about 3 months after my return, I would tell her what happened to me. She would cry for me, cry for Michelle, Hannah, and Joseph. All three of them she was very close friends with before she left with her own mission group. We agreed to name our first children after them, and if she and I ever decided to have another child, and it was a boy, we'd name him Austin. I never saw Uinta again after he and the 3 other warrior survivors who helped escort me home parted ways. He had spoken of returning to the other survivors they'd left with their friends in the Muchacanos tribe. There was also talk of them leading the fight against the survivors of the Red Castle Raiders after the Tocawana massacre. I don't know if the survivors of the Tocawanas just merged with the Muchacanos, successfully defeated the raiders who'd been pushed from Red Castle or anything. But I do know the Muchacanos would suffer their own minor and extreme tragedies over the years before they too would merge with another tribe. You asked in the beginning why I believe in Christ. I believe in him because I saw perfect examples of what his love, the love I've read about my whole life, is like. I saw that firsthand through Michelle, Hannah, Joseph, and in the eyes of Mr. Wesley. I think about what he said before our deaths all the time. I'm so sorry. Don't cry. It's all going to be okay, Michelle. Look at me. Look at me. You're going to be okay, Hannah. Trust me, please, sweetie. Stay strong. Look at me. You're going to be okay, Joseph. Look at me. You're going to be fine. You're going to make it out of this. You understand that, Paul? I did make it out of that. And I believe I was allowed to have a quick glimpse of what I had known before I even was, and will know again when my time on this earth is up. What I describe does absolutely no amount of justice to what I truly saw, but whenever I think about it in a silent moment in the dead of night, or when talking about it to a person like you, I find myself thinking of what God said to Moses in Exodus 3:14. I am who I am. There are no words, there is no image you can conjure up in the mind that can describe his enormity or power. If what I saw, who I saw, told me anything before the words that made me rise, it was that Mr. Wesley was also right when he told Michelle, Hannah, and Joseph that they would be okay. Their voices, souls, and forms had joined with him. They had returned to the all-encompassing being that ever was, is, and will be. The one who told my people thousands of years ago to call him Father, the one who sent his Son, and the one who left his Spirit for those who are chosen to walk this earth. I believe in him because I remember that face that made me fall to my knees in sheer awe. I've seen him in the eyes of my wife, my kids, my friends, and so many out there. And I remember the shape of that light before I myself rose from the grave. Hard to believe? Sure. I don't doubt that at all. I myself doubt sometimes, but just imagine living through it, seeing what I saw and feeling what I felt. You read about him, you learn more about what he says in his word, and you will understand who he is and the way he moves in this world. You will start to understand that there is something far more at play in this world than the tragedies of the wilderness, nations, or wars down south. Chapter 43, A Last Dance. Stepping past the gate, I heard the applause, and the band's music grew louder as I approached the square. It was pretty cold out now, and that wind made me raise the collar of my jacket as I passed my brothers and sisters in the street. Some were going towards the music, some were walking away from it. All who passed me greeted me, and I felt a smile as I greeted them back. The illumination of the warming flames between the tables glowed brighter, and the kids running through the streets made the scene all the more lovely. I thought a lot about everything I spoke to the stranger about, that Ulysses. I thought of his tragic story, about the divide, about his old tribe, and then about everything I told him about myself. The image of those glowing eyes seemed to take on normalcy as I spoke, but I could not read his thoughts for the life of me. I did not know if what I said affected him at all, or very deeply. We parted ways not long after I had told him my own story. We stood up, shook hands, and gave simple farewells before we both went our separate ways. I remember seeing him walking back towards the NCR trade compound or refugee village when I heard the gate crash to the ground. And from there, all I could see was the people in the streets and the gentle glow from the town square. That music grew louder. I passed a few people I knew who greeted me with smiles in the light of the street lamps and continued forward. It was very hard to talk about everything I did with the stranger, but I remember still thinking about him and about what he would do going forward in life if it had affected him in even the smallest way. I stepped through the crowd of my brothers and sisters lining the square, and when I saw that the dancing was already well underway, I took in the scene of so much joy and said lowly, "Lord, I'm very thankful for the opportunity you gave me this night. I only ask that if there was anything I said that was not you, that it fell by the wayside, that it fell on deaf ears. I again can't thank you enough for this opportunity and this night. Amen." Standing at the edge of the square, all the tables had been moved aside, and I watched the band playing in front of the head table as so many people danced. I clearly missed the chance to give my speech to Carl and Jessica. Based on the applause I heard on the way in, and the number of couples presently dancing together in the glow of the flames, I had missed the newlyweds' first dance as well. As much as I wanted to give my speech, I wouldn't have traded it for what I got to do for that man with such an awful past. Feeling myself smile even more amongst the crowd of new Canaanites lost in conversation, I located my wife standing amongst a group of ladies beside the perimeter of chairs, completely engaged in a conversation. Just as I took a step towards her, I heard a voice just to my left that was more than familiar. Sitting at the end of the chair perimeter closest to me was Nathan, the best man, wearing his cleanest white shirt and black slacks like the rest of the guardsmen off duty, including myself. His jacket acted as a cushion resting on the back of his chair while the man was surrounded by a group of 7 young kids. Nathan was showing them his hook hand and answering questions about the black cross-shaped tattoos along his forearms. He looked glad, but like he preferred to be alone, so I stepped up to his side. With a slap on his shoulder, I said aloud, "You aren't giving these kids bad ideas, right, Nathan?" He turned, looked up at me, saw my grin, and said coolly, "I'm trying not to, but they won't listen." I told the kids how they needed to leave Nathan alone or the hook was going to get them. Nathan gestured at them as I said this. The kids screamed and ran off laughing, and the man leaned back in his chair with a grin as he said to me, "So, look who decided to show up. Who said we even want you here anymore?" I only shook my head. "What are you doing over here? Why aren't you dancing?" I watched all the couples across the town square dancing, my eyes focusing on Nathan's friend of the guard he always tries to one-up, named Salgado. The strong mid-20s man spun one of the girls into his embrace and flipped her before setting her down and continuing to take her all over the dance floor. Everyone at the ceremony saw you winking at Jessica's bridesmaids. I could see the smile on his face widening in my peripherals as he only leaned back further in his chair. "I don't dance, LT." Yes, he did. I'd seen Nathan dancing with the girls at plenty of other weddings and town celebrations. He was actually one of the best dancers in the Guard, and that's saying something. It might be worth mentioning that most men in the community, especially men of the Guard, do everything they can to become great dancers when they aren't on duty. Since dancing is pretty much the only time men of the community are allowed to touch members of the opposite sex before the wedding night, most men of the Guard go above and beyond to become incredible on the dance floor just for weddings or town-wide celebrations. Dancing is not only allowed but really encouraged. This, of course, is only so long as the couples aren't dancing too provocatively or too close. In fact, it was at that moment that I saw Rhines dancing with his wife Melanie before pausing their two-stepping to break up 2 young adults getting a little too close. Seeing him step between the couple and gesture for them to take a break on the sidelines before getting right back to dancing with his wife was pretty funny. Either way, I answered Nathan's overt lie. "Oh, I get it. None of the girls would have you after that speech you gave." He laughed that time. "Nah, it isn't like that. I'm just not really feeling up to it right now." Putting a hand on his shoulder, I asked, "You all right?" "Yeah, just sorta miss Aliana is all." I thought about that tribal girl he accidentally got too acquainted with on his first mission at 18. It was always pretty strange to hear that he was still in touch with her. He'd even requested leave to visit her a couple of times in the past 6 or 7 years. "What tribe did you say she is with again?" An idle thought, I said out loud, And one he answered, Panguichu, not that far from 89 City. A few extra days east. He returned to what he was saying. I've been wanting to write a letter to her, but I can't write lefty for the life of me. I haven't been able to tell her what happened since I got back from the Sevieri scout. Hearing this made me swat him on the shoulder as I caught his eye and said, Well, damn it, Nathan. Why don't you ask one of your friends to write it for you? Or heck, I'll write the letter out for you. The fact you're still talking to that girl after so long really means a lot, son. Nathan said, Believe me when I say I couldn't have you write out what I usually send her. I couldn't stop my eyes from rolling before I heard that dumb laugh, and he had to add, It gets pretty gross. Why do I even bother talking to you? He heard my automatic remark saying, Ha, I was wondering that too, Paul. Part of me really wished he didn't have this defense mechanism of his, despite how silly it was at times. Seriously though, we'd be happy to help you out. Perhaps you can censor yourself for just a little while until you get yourself a pencil holder for that hook contraption. Thanks, Paul. I'd really appreciate that. But seriously though, why are you talking to me? He gestured towards that group of ladies nearby, and my eyes landed on my wife as the young man added, Go dance with your wife or else I'll dance with her. And believe me, you won't want that. Feeling my eyes rolling so much that they were about to unscrew themselves out of my head, I left the laughing fool a final slap on the arm as I took his advice and approached my wife. With her back to me, the romantic violin-heavy tune ended. There was a loud applause as the dancers caught their breaths or changed partners, and I slipped my arms around Danny's waist. She laughed, the ladies laughed, and I asked Danny's company if I could steal my wife away for a while. The ladies nodded, some looking around and hoping for their own husbands to do what I did, and my wife and I glided toward the floor. Taking her hand in mine, and with my other hand on her lower back, I felt the other dancers around us fade from existence for the moment as I looked at those incredible green eyes. I watched those lips curl into a smile, and felt her long silk-like wavy hair graze my hand as it shimmered almost red in the warm light. The next song had just picked up and we started slow. The little band now playing the tune of what I believed might have been one of Dean Martin's a little more upbeat songs. She and I danced a simple East Coast swing, and the younger dancers who loved a good swing song faded away even more as I met my wife's gaze. At last, after a simple turn and then pivot to get around Lieutenant Roth and his wife, I managed to whisper to Danny's loving face, It's certainly been a while since we've done anything like this. She only nodded, her smile grew brighter, and I could not look away for the life of me when she finally said, It certainly has. The last time was probably the Guard's Christmas Day gathering 3 years ago when we danced at all. I thought about that, gave her another turn, brought her close, and immediately dipped her. She was not surprised at all. She went right along with it, and that gentle smile remained on her face as she saw me think. The music slowed, we slowed down with it, and her eyes looked into mine with love and concern. Are you okay, honey? Before I could realize the question, she added, You were gone for a while tonight. Some of us were getting a little worried. I shook myself back into the moment and answered her loving face sincerely, Of course, I'm feeling better than I had in a while. Her eyes stayed filled with concern but lightened a bit, and her smile grew wider as her soft, delicate features compelled me to explain further. I actually just had the chance to tell a stranger about Christ. That doesn't really happen that often on or off shift lately. I told him my testimony. Despite my assurance from earlier, her eyes filled with even more concern as she said, Oh, Paul, are you okay? A question my calm words from earlier could not answer. I realized the only answer that would assure her came when I brought her even closer into me as we danced slowly. Now it was me who smiled wider, a sight she probably didn't see that often lately now that I think of it. I'm great, sweetie. I'll admit it's still very hard to talk about it, I thought, still generally satisfied overall. Still not that sure what to think about the man, though. He was definitely troubled. I don't frankly know how he took literally anything I said or anything he said. Danny drew closer into my embrace, looked deep into my eyes, and asked with the utmost innocence in her soft breath, "Let's pray for him. Right now." No words, I looked into the love in my wife's eyes, remembering in a glimpse what I had told the stranger, what I knew. I had seen that love before, and the sight of her love and sincerity in the request made me nod. She smiled, placed her head on my chest as we continued our slow dance, and I held her tightly with all I had as she asked with the tenderness of the girl I met when I was just a kid in her voice, "Dear Lord, thank you for this night." I could hear the tears of love in her voice as her slender arms tightened around me. For Jessica, for Carl, for this amazing husband, and our beautiful children. The song slowed, I held her tighter, and shut my eyes even tighter. Thank you for the work my husband gets to do. He has so much love to give, and we're both thankful for any chance he gets to share it with others. She was right. I thought of the love and joy I'd seen in her eyes as we danced, the eyes that were shut so tight as she held me with all her strength. I could hear the passion in her sniffles as she held me, and the truth in her words. I thought of the blank, hollow, glowing red eyes of the stranger, and the deep words devoid of all emotion as she continued to pray. I held her closer, burying my cheek into her head, thinking of everything and everyone I'd seen since stepping back through those gates. I thought of the joy, the happiness, the laughter, the love, and everything I'd seen consciously or subconsciously between the ceremony and what I've been seeing since this dance. I thought of the world happening around us as I envisioned the image of the stunning mother of our wonderful children now in my arms. I thought of those guards from every detachment of the day shift, all dancing with their sweethearts or the other girls. I thought of Salgado spinning that pretty young brunette in the striped dress, and about the children gathering around Nathan as he enjoyed the sidelines for a change. I thought of the men and women of town laughing and smiling around the edge of the square, about the congregated elders and even Bishop Mordecai smiling on the sidelines, about the men like John Langdon and Rhines joyfully prying apart young couples, and about Carl and his new wife dancing closer towards the center of the square. I felt the delicate arms of my wife grip me even tighter as I heard her still speaking to God.
Saw the walls of New Canaan and the scavengers circled, and the strength or fire to take. Too high, too strong.
Hearing Danny speak, and seeing the image of so much love surrounding us, I wiped my eye and caught a glimpse of the girl I noticed Ramos dancing with earlier. Kathy Alessandro looked absolutely beautiful in the long blue dress of the other bridesmaids. They were so lovely together, and the beauty of that sight gave me thoughts of that young man I saw during our revenge for my daughter and Ramos's love that would never be. Sarah Parsons. The thoughts of the late Mr. Padilla and Sarah Parsons and the incredible love of this night were almost too much. I held my wife tighter, and she held me even more. So much death, so much tragedy, since the time of my first mission to now. So much war and horror between what happened to the Sevieres, to the time my ancestors spoke with 2 other strangers before we were even established. And yet right now, I stand with my wife, forgetting what the warmth of her embrace feels like during all the day-to-day worries and duties until I can finally slow down enough just to feel those arms in a moment like this. I feel the tears continue to well in my eyes, but they cannot fall as I hear her passionate thanks.
They couldn't live on their own like most scavengers, so gave them purpose, turned their hunger into a weapon. The wall of New Canaan, too high for Kaiser, too proud maybe, or maybe something there from his past that needed killing.
I felt her hands on the center of my upper back, lean down and kiss the top of her head. I could feel her smile, the side of her head still pressed to my chest as I feel the wetness of a tear pierce my shirt. I heard the laughing of children playing, and the giggling of the girls being spun around the dance floor by my brothers and sons. I heard the happy tears of the women old and young, still talking about the beautiful ceremony and the loving speeches. I felt her grip adjust, still not feeling her grip lessen in even the slightest. Even through my jacket and shirt, I felt her place the softest kiss on my chest, her voice even more lovely than the skill of the band.
You must be willing to kill anyone. Children, mothers, the weak, elders. If these new Canaanites value the generations, that is what you must kill.
I don't think I'd ever been happier than at this moment. Hearing her speak, hearing her love me so much, I felt the welling tears in my eyes. I gripped the woman I married even tighter, and felt her head pull away as she whispered into my neck with a tearful breath. Thank you so much, Lord. I love you. It is in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. I felt her head slowly pull away a little more as we slowly opened our eyes. If at any brief, tiny little point in the last 22 years, I wasn't sure I made the right choice in marrying Danny, it was eradicated by the tears of love and overwhelming joy and thankfulness in her green eyes after the word, Amen. The song ended with a long and final drawn-out note, and Danny wiped her eyes with the back of her hand before I brought her in close once more. I don't tell you this nearly as often as I ought to, but I love you so much, Danny. She smiled even wider, wiped her eyes again, threw her arms around my neck once more, and buried her face into my shoulder, whispering, I love you too, Paul, as the applause around us erupted for the band. Together, we shuffled towards the outer edge of the couples on the dance floor as we awaited the next slow song to start, and we took in our surroundings. It was hard at first to take my focus off Danny's lovely face, even as she collected herself. But there was so much to see. Danny gestured off towards the people on the perimeter. I looked to the source of what caused that smile. Together we watched Joseph running around with some of his friends. I couldn't help my own smile at the thought of our son when Danny and I caught sight of Constable Hanshaw with Leslie under his arm. She chuckled at the man towering over everyone else in the crowd with his arm around such a petite woman. Drawing Danny closer, the next sight to catch my eye was one that made me laugh out loud for a moment before catching it. Without anything else, I turned us so we could both take in the sight of Duncan standing beside Joshua on the edge of the crowd. But what caused my outburst, and then Danny's, was the image of Hannah trying and failing to pull Duncan towards the dance floor, the young man anchored completely in place. The look on Danny's face was a confused one at that, and one I could only answer with a shrug at thought of the unique infatuation our second girl had with that stoic young survivalist. My eyes lingered on Graham for a moment, mostly wondering if he was having a nice time, when Danny pressed into me tighter and motioned toward the other end of the square. Danny let out an audible "aw," but I simply wasn't sure what to feel at the sight of Michelle still in the arms of that Isaiah Albright. It was only for a moment, though, since we watched her part from him, leaving the young man a quick peck on the cheek before rushing over towards a group of elderly women. Seeing the bundle in the arms of one of the women, our daughter was handed the infant under the care of the adoring older women when Michelle's attention was immediately turned to another young man who looked like Lieutenant, Kennedy's man Ethan, extending a hand to her asking for the next dance. We watched our girl kiss her baby, our grandchild, on the forehead, and I felt my wife hold me tighter as Michelle asked the older women to hold the baby for one more song. The old ladies eagerly accepted, apparently thrilled to spend more time with the baby, as Michelle took the hand of Kennedy's man before immediately twirling her in. I found myself chuckling and shaking my head, still completely unsure what to think about Michelle, the baby, or the young men who just wanted to dance with her. The tighter embrace of my wife and the feeling of her cheek pressed into my chest told me without anything else how I was supposed to feel, and I certainly felt that way when I held her, and the next slow song started. That violin, that laughter, that love that surrounded us in all forms, the embrace of my wife, the lives of our children, the peace and serenity made this the best night of my life. As we slowly danced together, I could feel her eyes on me once again, and just as I went to turn to her again, I caught something in my peripherals. Bringing my wife's head close to my own, we looked to see our son sitting at the edge of the crowd, again seemingly locked in passionate prayer. I thought of when I saw our son doing that immediately before I left for my chat with the stranger, and Danny and I stepped slowly to the beat as I said idly, "Joseph sure is praying a lot lately from the looks of things," hoping my wife might have noticed that earlier as well. After a moment, she cooed almost sleepily, "Yeah, he has." Just as I was about to ask why she thought that might be, I saw that look in her eye again. I saw that complete love, adoration, and that smile. I drew my love close, completely forgot what I was even talking about when I saw Joseph leap up and begin chasing his friends again in my peripherals, and leaned in closer towards Danny's face. Those innocent eyes, those quivering lips, and those soft and perfect cheeks turning that wonderful shade of pink made me lean in even closer, until I could only just feel her warm breath touch my nose in the cool breeze. Luckily, the love my wife and I had for each other couldn't go further because, just like a true second of a lieutenant's guard detachment, and just like a true, well-mannered Christian man, John Langdon and his wife stepped between us. "Break it up, you two," I grinned, shook my head, and didn't like the fact my wife's delicate hands were replaced by John's rough hands in the blink of an eye before he threw an arm around my shoulder. My second and I stood with arms on each other's shoulders as we grinned at the sight of Mrs. Langdon taking my wife away as the lead, watching Danny getting whisked away while Ingrid was saying, "Here, Danny, step like this. Follow my lead. Me or John will show Paul these new steps later," before disappearing into the crowded dance floor. It again was not uncommon at all for partners to get split up and carted in different directions by members of the Guard in leadership positions. It was just uncommon for an LT of the Guard and his wife to experience that. Still, John and I watched Mrs. Langdon take my laughing wife away in a seamless moment before John gestured off to the side. Was I getting too close with my own wife, Mr. Langdon? Still with his arm over my shoulder, we approached the chairs on the side, just a little, but Ingrid's been wanting to show Danny some new steps for a while. Also, where did you sneak off to? We were eager to hear your speech. Standing on the edge of the dancers, we watched our laughing wives appearing and disappearing in the middle of so many moving dancers. I felt my second smile aimed right at me as I answered, "You don't mind if I have your wife show me the lead steps later? Bishop and elders might frown on it if you showed me here and now." The man chuckled loudly. "I'll let her know to find you some evening. Perhaps we can all do dinner after shift some night soon. Lord knows the kids will enjoy that." We saw Joseph running around with John's kids, weaving between the dancing couples on the outer edge, and looking like they might need another reminder to keep their games away from the dance floor, when John added, "Seriously though, where did you disappear to?" The two of us took a step back to give Hudson, Ray, and the two girls they were dancing with some room. Both of us internally marveling at the fact those two young inseparables even danced with girls together, as I said to John, "I just met a stranger outside the gates. Man wanted to talk to me about our faith." I paused, the both of us smiling at the sight of our missionary friend Daniel dancing with both the young widow Kinsley Dunn and her little daughter Everly. Got to tell the guy my testimony. After a moment, John glanced at me with a simple, "Dang, you all right?" I again had never felt better. His words and another brief glimpse of Mrs. Langdon teaching my wife some new steps in the middle of the crowded dance floor made me tell my brother what was true. "I'm fine." I tried to find the only white dress and my son of the guard Carl in the crowd, adding, "So's he, I think." I just couldn't be more thankful for a night like this. "You know where Carl and Jessica disappeared to, by the way?" I paused again as John pushed me back with his arm, narrowly avoiding a collision with Doyle's man, Mitchell, and my neighbor's girl, Mary Hughes, breezed past us. Hearing Mitchell and the girl I personally helped save on the Seviera Scout last week both say, "So sorry, Mr. Lieutenant Young," as they passed by with such smiles made it impossible to be even slightly upset. The look in Mary's eyes when she noticed me said how she wanted to tell me how she and Maya Lukane were doing since returning home. But the girl was soon laughing and twirling in the arms of Mitchell. I glanced back at John to finish what I was saying. "You might actually know the stranger I met with." The two of us took another step back till we could feel the people standing and sitting on the chair perimeter behind us. I met the look in John's eyes, where I instantly saw one answer to a question I asked. The question in his look said, "Do you really have to ask where Carl and Jessica likely disappeared to?" I shook my head, remembered the obvious, and then he replied aloud, "The stranger you met? I assume it was Mr. Creepy Eyes?" Don't call him that. I nudged the grinning man in an instant. But yes, how did you know? Lucky guess, he answered automatically before adding, it had to have been either him or Ranger Townsley, although you would have said so if it was Ranger Townsley. Through all the love, laughter, happiness, and the loud conversation of retired men and their wives behind us, I thought briefly about the deep, emotionless voice that somehow emitted the worst anger beneath the tone. John added, but I also told you I spoke with that guy in the duster for a bit around about a week ago. Anyway, where did you tell him to start? Bible-wise, I mean. Thoughts of that voice faded in a flash when I felt John's nudge to my ribs and I saw him chuckle out. His eyes are brown, by the way. Just wanted to remind you of that, since it feels like half the guard is in on a joke the other half isn't. The idea of that joke made me laugh, but I just saw those eyes. I was just staring into them as I spoke to the man and told him my story scarcely 30 minutes ago. There was no joke. I saw the way the eyes glowed even brighter, even more lifeless, sitting above the breathing mask and beneath the long, dark dreadlocks. Just then, the crowd parted and I saw my Danny again, still laughing away with Ingrid Langdon. And her innocent, loving words she prayed to God in my embrace and on that dance floor floated through my mind again as I remembered those green eyes. I told him to check out the Gospels first. I paused, feeling John's look. Actually, I mentioned Jonah, then corrected it. The man put his hands in his pockets, then looked around as if just now remembering he was supposed to keep track of his kids, saying somewhat idly, yeah, Jonah's a good one for wayward souls, but 40 days before the destruction of a whole city might be a gloomy place to start. God spared Nineveh, John, I said automatically, joining in the applause of everyone surrounding the dance floor as the song came to an end. The dancing couples hugged, bowed, and many of the girls walked to their friends on the edge or returned to their kids, while almost every single young man, whether man of the guard or man of a trade, stayed on that floor, gesturing for other girls to be their next dance. I watched Michelle part from Doyle's man and receive the baby David before joining the group of older women in a vacant chair. Those wonderful ladies helping her rest and keeping her safe from the group of young men asking her for the next dance. The married couples stepped off the floor with linked arms or stayed in place to await the next song as each member of the band took the break to hydrate. I saw Danny maneuver off to the side, still laughing with and talking to Ingrid Langdon before joining a group of women from one of their groups. I caught a glimpse of Nathan walking past us, having finally had his fill of wallflowering, his first dance partner of the night being my Hannah, who'd evidently failed at trying to get Duncan Schmidt to dance with her. As the new dancers and couples took the floor, I watched as Nathan spun my little Hannah around and around, hearing that sweet laugh of hers as she held my son's new improvised hook hand. John answered my words. True, but it's a real shame that he couldn't learn God's lesson till he was put in his lowest place. And not even then, since his book ends with him becoming the whiniest prophet in the Bible by getting all pissy that he didn't get to see any fireworks. Ha ha! This casual summarization of Jonah from John made me grin. The band just picked up their instruments again as more dancers took the floor. Without anything else, any other thought, I returned the wave and the smile of Hannah and Nathan before he started stepping with her at the first note of the new song as I said to John, I once read something about the tomb of the prophet Jonah in Mosul, Iraq. I don't remember much of that pre-war article, but I remember thinking, that tomb was built and worshipped at even by Muslims in the centuries and millennia since its construction. I met eyes with John. You're right, John. Jonah's story in the Bible tells us how he didn't learn his lesson by the end of the text, but the fact the Assyrians made such a splendid tomb for him really tells you something about what happened after the book of Jonah ends. The rest of the Bible, history, and the existence of that tomb seem to say that there was so much more that happened between him and the people of Nineveh after God made the tree wither. Feeling John's gaze on the side of my head, I was about to turn and meet it when I noticed Joseph again sitting by himself on the perimeter of chairs. I gave John a nudge, smirked at him, and left him with, I'm going to check up on my son. You go dance with your wife. Glancing toward the crowd, I added with a wink. Looks like the Lockwood couple is getting closer than Danny and I ever were. taking a seat beside Joseph. The kid's elbows were resting on his knees, his hands clenched together, his eyes closed. I briefly wondered what Joseph was praying about, but didn't want to interrupt him as I placed my arm gently over his shoulder. The fact his frame didn't seem to notice my arm on his shoulder in even the slightest took me a bit off guard, but I let the boy concentrate. My eyes went to Danny, still laughing with Ingrid and the other ladies, then to Michelle, still holding her baby, and sitting beside the elderly women while speaking to some of the young men, and then to Hannah, still giggling as Nathan spun her around the dance floor. My eyes drifted towards the flames of one of the nearby torches, where I saw the burned and wrapped man just outside the glow, his eyes seeming to shine despite the darkness. The eyes between the wrappings were as bright as the strangers were. They were as blue as the strangers were red, but equally as tragic. In the glow of the burning flame, I saw the tears of passion and absolute love in the green of Danny's eyes, and I saw the tears of fear and absolute sorrow in the green of Mr. Wesley's eyes. The heat of the torch touched my skin, and I felt the pain of those burns as the Tokawanis village died in the inferno when I heard those words. "I'm so sorry, Paul. He's just too good." The sound of the gunshot made me shake myself back into the present, and I felt my son finally twitch. The boy raised his head slowly, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Hi, Dad," pulling the kid closer. Together we looked out at the dancers when I asked him, "You having fun, buddy?"
The new Canaanites. They supplied medicine, food traded with others, civilization, a hand from the past, not history, but maybe a past deeper, farther than that, to a place where this God really exists. If so, his handiwork and people belong elsewhere, not in this place. Another symbol